Before I begin, I want to give a heads up that I will be talking about trauma in this sermon. I hope most of you will be able to move through this uncomfortable topic with me, but if you think for you this will cause harm, please take care of yourself however you need to. My family name is Shenstone. My ancestor, Benjamin Shenstone, the E was added later to make us sound more distinguished, Shenstone. He was a religious man. Having arrived on this continent from England one Saturday in 1832, by Sunday he had not only found a church, but formed an opinion of it. "Hungry, but had no meal," he wrote. Large place, like the construction of the pulpit, do not approve of the entrance being same end as pulpit and so near to it. It amuses me to think that Benjamin's strong opinions about coffee hour and architecture somehow presage my family finding a home in Unitarian Universalism, although he himself seems to have been Baptist and would probably be appalled. At one point, his wife vetoes letting their son apprentice for a printer because the printer is Universalist. So nearly 200 years later, I find myself in another pulpit, given free rein to speak my piece as I depart Atlanta after 10 years in this congregation, headed off on my own adventure of becoming a minister. I will strive to be less gruff than my ancestor in sharing my thoughts with this congregation. As I embark, I want to talk about belonging and why it's so important in our work, personally and as a congregation, to heal racialized trauma. I'm going to put this in the context of my own search for belonging as a white person who feels deeply called to healing, in general and around racism specifically. This call to healing is at the core of my call to professional ministry. I reread my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather's diary in response to guidance from Resmaa Menakem, who we heard earlier. Menakem is a trauma therapist who has served military contractors in Afghanistan, among others. He focuses on healing for Black bodies, white bodies, and police bodies, with the hope that healing individuals becomes healing for our culture. And I should note that in this sermon, I'm going to talk mainly about white bodies and Black bodies, but I know that that is not everyone. I see you. When I talk about racial trauma, specifically that caused by white supremacy, or white body supremacy, as Menakem calls it, I'm using Robin DiAngelo's definition: the all-encompassing centrality and assumed superiority of people defined and perceived as white, and the practices based on this assumption. So not just hate groups, though that is certainly an extreme form, but also the everyday assumption that whiteness is normal, and it's normal that it should be dominant, that is part of American culture. White supremacy is a generational trauma. For many Black folks, this means stress and adaptive mechanisms passed down from surviving enslavement. For many Indigenous folks, it has to do with surviving genocide and occupation. For many white folks, he says, it has to do with centuries of trauma perpetrated by white bodies on other white bodies in a Europe where torture was commonplace, and those who came to the New World were often fleeing some kind of trauma, whether persecution, famine, or plague, or were incarcerated or indentured. That trauma was taken out on darker bodies. It still lands viscerally on the bodies, particularly of Black folks. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, and too many more. Even talking about this is painful. If you feel triggered, again, please care for yourself however you need to. This recording will be available later. If you can stick with me in this moment, I invite you to take a deep breath and notice where in your body you might feel that pain. If you can, be still and hold it for one more breath. I grew up with a wonderful, loving family, but in my adult life, I have wandered far from home. As I have moved around the country, trying to create a home for myself and seeing more of the ways that white supremacy culture colors everything, I have sometimes feared that since my ancestors were occupiers, there may be no place I truly belong. I suspect that's one of the fears that makes it so hard for many white people to acknowledge racism and genocide. My ancestors, especially those who came from England starting in the 1630s, profited from a system in which white bodies could immigrate voluntarily and maintaining any capital they might possess and take control of land at the expense, directly or indirectly, of others being brought here forcibly or removed from that land. I still benefit from these things because I have a white body. That makes me deeply uncomfortable. But again, naming that and feeling those feelings is important healing work. So I'm going to pause here for another breath and invite you to do the same. I want to make space for you, especially if the pain you're carrying comes from you or your ancestors being displaced or enslaved, and if it comes from knowing your ancestors directly caused that displacement, enslavement, or other trauma. Again, if you can stick with me, I invite you to notice where in your body you feel it. We know that speaking these truths is powerful. Silence keeps trauma rolling around in our bodies and shooting off in violent ways. That's why UUism is working right now to speak truth about our tradition's history that is similarly fraught with difficulty. Our history at UUCA is certainly one to reckon with, too. This congregation came apart in the 1940s over the issue of who belonged here. Though we later found ways, powerful ways, to come together in support of civil rights, that tension still exists in some form today, and it's essential to know it and name it and hold it. For white folks' part in healing racialized trauma, which is essential if we are to stop perpetuating it, one step Menachem asks us to take is to consider the circumstances of our ancestors arriving on this continent. For many of us, these are glossed over or even glorified, which makes it impossible to address what actually happened. I'm finding that in addition to facing some true parts of my heritage and holding the pain, I am also gaining some valuable tools for healing by becoming more familiar with my ancestors' actual experience. To begin, I can address not only the trauma my ancestors may have participated in, but also that which they may have carried. Benjamin Shenston's trauma was different from that of many Black and Indigenous ancestors, but it was still real. His family spent 6 weeks in steerage, overcrowded with 29 people, sleeping, cooking, and getting sick in a space meant for 12. He was unable to lift his head for most of the trip due to illness. Seawater sloshed about as he and his wife Mary cared for 7 children, the youngest only 2. My family is fortunate to have Benjamin's reasons for taking this perilous journey preserved in a carefully handed down diary. The cause, all capitals, of my thinking at first about sojourning into America was the general and universal depression of business of every line, the difficulty of getting a livelihood and having no prospect of obtaining employment for my children. These things conjointly operated to perplex my mind and to devise what I could possibly do for my rising family and myself. Benjamin came here hoping to escape the despair of looming poverty from an overcrowded, industrializing London that had yet to create a sewer system and was regularly visited by plague. Again, naming this trauma is important, and it helps me know how much resilience my family also carries. To have gone on to build new lives in an unfamiliar world. Thanks to research from my mom and my grandpa Shenstone, I know I belong to generations of farmers, craftspeople, and religious leaders. They worked with their hands and minds, contributed to society, and connected with their concept of the divine. They made new lives for their families from New Jersey northward to Canada, and that feels related to why I felt called to be in New England, that's where I belonged for seminary. Their stories not only give me this sense of belonging, a heritage to draw on while I must also accept its challenges, but beyond that, it also validates my own strengths, the things I value about myself, and a sense of capability that I and we can take on the challenge of white supremacy. As Americans of European descent have taken on so many other challenges. With this heritage, I am better equipped not to get mired in guilt and self-pity, or to rely on those who are Black to soothe me, as white body supremacy has so often demanded they do, lest the discomfort of my white body be blown through theirs, blow my trauma out on theirs. I have ancestors who were clever, hardworking people, and so do you, whether you know their stories or not. We, as UUs, have UU forebears who are clever, hardworking, wise people. While they caused, experienced, and passed on trauma, they also passed on resilience. And that's another gift that I found hidden in my ancestors' story. Here's one story of that resilience from my family. For all his stuffiness, Benjamin had ways to settle himself in exceedingly difficult circumstances where one could easily have a fight, flight, or freeze reaction. He was constantly having prayer meetings, often with strangers he met and befriended along the journey. Passing through New York on his way to Canada, where he eventually settles, he befriends an elderly member of a congregation that is currently without a pastor. And mind you, he's only been in New York for a total of 2 weeks, roughly, before he moves on. So he's making friends quickly. I think this was maybe Wednesday after the Sunday. Seriously. So he befriends this elderly member of this congregation. They don't have a pastor, so she invites him to her home. And they have a wonderful family meal with cakes, and it sounds way better than what they've been eating on the sailing ship. And after dinner, 40 other people show up at her house. And in contrast to his usual detached style, he practically gushes in his diary. The time was spent singing and praying, by which means I discovered them to be such as I cannot but love and feel at home with, experiencing the same changes and breathing the same desires. I cannot but love and feel at home, breathing the same desires. Does that not sound like UUCA to you, like Unitarian Universalism? Benjamin Shenstone made it through his difficult adventure because of his strong family and because he knew how to find belonging wherever he went. He knew and carried with him in his diary songs and prayers that made him feel settled, and he was constantly looking for other bodies to share that settling with. This reminds me of my own journey, pre-Atlanta, moving frequently around the country for work, and always stopping in at the UU congregation. Here at UUCA, we use music, singing, breathing, moving, and other spiritual practices to settle our bodies, to calm that vagus nerve, and let our bodies go into rest and grow mode. When bodies settle together, we are learning even backed up by science. We experience belonging. Have you ever been in the midst of grief or shock or loss, and someone just sat calmly with you? How did that feel? Settled bodies can move through trauma from the best parts of themselves in a way that allows growth and activation when we need it. Activation to speak up, even when it's awkward, to change policies and cultures, to get up, to rise over and over. And unlike the misleading sense of belonging offered by white nationalist groups, ours strives for integrity, to name and hold the difficult stuff, and welcome everyone who seeks. That's why what we do as UUs is so important. After 10 years as a youth advisor, board member and president, choir member, anti-racism, anti-oppression, multiculturalism strategy leader, and lay minister, I know the tougher parts of this congregation along with the good ones. The times when our ability to settle and embrace fell short, when I've received dismissive comments regarding my youth, femaleness, or the shape of my body. The insistence sometimes that racism doesn't happen here, or complaints that people who are trying not to be further traumatized are limiting the freedom of speech of those who are traumatizing them. Times when my efforts went unacknowledged. The friends who have left because we unearthed or created trauma we could not hold. Those experiences made it hard to be here sometimes. But I have also been held. A congregant who had made a comment about my body came up to me weeks later and apologized. A friend let me share the burdens of stories I carried from working at the trauma hospital by listening without interruption. After I spoke up in a congregational meeting, party planners reconceived our building's 50th birthday away from a white-centered TV show theme to a rad 1960s one. Sermons resonated with challenges in my personal life and brought me to tears. And there's been so much singing. I have seen you hold each other too. Support groups for caregivers and cancer survivors, calls by lay ministers, funerals and vigils, the memorial for the Reeb and Leutzo families who lost their beloveds in the civil rights movement, checking in after discussions of whiteness and racism. More and more, sharing and hearing stories that confront the myth of white bodies being the normal and rightful controllers of the narrative, resolving to lead from the front, not the middle. As I go back to the Northeast to make a new home, it matters that I have found belonging here. All the love and support of this congregation carries me forward, and I am so grateful. I also go forth that knowing that not everyone feels the same way here. I have an advantage in that my educated New England middle class heritage is closely related to the dominant stories and styles within UUism. But the more we are able to hold all the different kinds of trauma that people come here with, the more we will trust each other with our gifts and the gifts of our heritage. The more we will be able to offer belonging to everyone. And I believe that then we will be much closer to being the culture that can supplant white supremacy. Again, Resmaa Menakem's words ring true. We will not end white body supremacy or any form of human evil by trying to tear it to pieces. Instead, we can offer people better ways to belong and better things to belong to. My prayer is that you know how much the belonging you have offered me means, and how much it means to me to have been able to hold this congregation in my care, in my many roles as a congregant. My prayer for you as our entwined journeys, yours and mine, disentangle, is to keep leaning in to holding yourselves and each other. Whether, like Benjamin Shenston in that New York church, you just arrived here in this congregation or on this land just yesterday, or your people have been here since time immemorial, hold on to your roots for yourself, each other, and this community. Try to resurface them where they are buried. Welcome them when they are unfamiliar, and face them when they are hard. Use the tools you already have, the tools that give us the sense of belonging, that hold us even when we're not sure that we really belong here. All that music and breathing and moving, use them and grow your ability to use new ones. Use them to stick with the tough stuff. Talk about what happens when we disagree, when people feel unseen. Use our covenant. Invest in healthy, honest communication, and stay present with pain as much as you can. The more you do that, the more the gift of belonging, which you have so generously shared with me, becomes a gift to our hurting nation. We will not end white body supremacy or any form of human evil by trying to tear it to pieces. Instead, we can offer people better ways to belong and better things to belong to. May we, rooted in the power of our ancestors, healing our bodies, be that offering.